It is the last week of April 1945, and the world is holding its breath. Above ground, Berlin is no longer a city, but a roaring sea of flames, a symphony of destruction played by Soviet artillery. The dreaded Red Army, once a distant threat on the Eastern Front, is no longer miles away. They are mere blocks away, their boots echoing through the rubble-strewn streets. The end is not just near, it is here. But 55 feet underground, shielded from the apocalypse above, lies a different reality. In the damp, cold concrete of the Führer, the air is thick with the scent of mildew and despair. Here, Adolf Hitler, the man who had once commanded millions with an iron will and a hypnotic voice, is a shadow of his former self. He is no longer the charismatic Führer who held the nation in his thrall, but a stooped, trembling old man, his left hand shaking uncontrollably, his eyes hollowed out by defeat. The God-King of the Third Reich has been reduced to a mortal, frail, and cornered. His days are now a grim, repetitive ritual of delusion. He spends his waking hours hunched over a massive map table, a sprawling representation of a Germany that is being devoured piece by piece. With a palsied hand, he moves the colored pins representing his armies, divisions that have been shattered, encircled, or simply no longer exist. He orchestrates grand counteroffensives with phantom panzers and ghost battalions, issuing commands to generals who are dead or captured. He speaks of Steiner's attack, a final, desperate assault that will miraculously push back the Soviets, a fantasy that has no basis in the brutal reality unfolding just a few dozen feet above his head. His few remaining generals and loyalists look on in a state of horrified, suffocating silence. Men like Keitel, Jodl, and Krebs, once the architects of Blitzkrieg and masters of European conquest, now stand as impotent witnesses to their leader's complete detachment from reality. They see the vacant stare, they hear the nonsensical orders, and they understand the truth that Hitler cannot accept. The map is not a tool of command. It is a canvas of illusions. Their whispered conversations in the narrow corridors are not of strategy, but of survival, of surrender, of how to escape the final, inevitable collapse. Each update from the front lines, delivered with a heavy heart, is another nail in the coffin of their 1,000-year Reich. The Führer itself has transformed. What was once intended as the nerve center of a vast empire, a fortress from which the final victory would be directed, is no longer a command center. It is a tomb, a concrete sarcophagus waiting for its most infamous occupant. The constant hum of the ventilation system sounds like a funeral dirge. The once pristine walls are now damp and stained, weeping for the downfall of a nation. The bunker has become the final, claustrophobic stage for the Gitterdmeering, the twilight of the gods that Hitler himself had so often invoked. Here, in this subterranean maze of concrete and steel, history's darkest chapter is about to reach its grim and pathetic conclusion, not with a bang, but with the quiet, desperate scratching of pins on a map of a world that was already gone. April 1945. Berlin is a city of ghosts, a smoking ruin under a sky choked with ash. Below the dying city, in the Führer, another world is collapsing. Adolf Hitler, the man who once commanded legions and redrew the map of Europe, now rules over a subterranean kingdom of concrete and despair. His 1,000-year Reich has barely lasted a dozen, and its final act is playing out 50 feet underground. The atmosphere in the bunker is a toxic cocktail of fear, fanaticism, and denial. The constant thunder of Soviet artillery is the soundtrack to their daily lives, a percussive reminder of the end. Maps are spread out on tables, showing armies that no longer exist, divisions that are just names on a page. Hitler, a stooped figure with trembling hands and a sallow complexion, still moves phantom battalions across these maps, his voice a hoarse whisper. His world has shrunk to this cramped, damp space, and his audience is a dwindling cast of true believers, sycophants, and those too terrified to leave. The rats, as they say, are leaving this sinking ship. For years, the Nazi elite orbited Hitler like planets around a sun. Their power, their wealth, their very existence derived from his favor. But now, with the Red Army just streets away, that loyalty is being tested. Survival has become the new ideology. First, there's Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall Göring, Hitler's designated successor, the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe, the man who amassed a personal fortune of stolen art. For years, Göring has been a larger-than-life figure, a symbol of the regime's power and excess. But as the war turned, he fell from grace. The Luftwaffe's failure to stop the Allied bombing raids on Germany earned him Hitler's constant scorn. By 1945, Göring is a bloated, morphine-addicted figure, increasingly sidelined from the real centers of power. He had retreated to his Alpine estate in Berchtesgaden, far from the gittered Meering unfolding in Berlin. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, the last gathering of the Nazi paladins takes place in the bunker. It's a grim affair. Hitler announces his decision to stay in Berlin and die there. He tells everyone else they are free to leave. This is the signal Göring has been waiting for. From Berchtesgaden, Göring looks at the situation. Hitler is trapped, likely to die or be captured. A 1941 decree names Göring as Hitler's successor should he become incapacitated. To Göring, this is his moment. He sends a carefully worded telegram to Hitler in the bunker. He states that if he doesn't hear back by 10 p.m. on April 23rd, he will assume Hitler is incapacitated and will take over leadership of the Reich. It's a political power grab, wrapped in the language of legal procedure. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the Führerbunker, it is seen as nothing short of high treason. The man who reads the telegram to Hitler is his private secretary, Martin Bormann. Bormann is a master of manipulation, a shadowy figure who has long despised Göring and coveted his position. He frames the telegram in the worst possible light, portraying it as an ultimatum, an act of rebellion. Hitler, already teetering on the edge of a complete breakdown, explodes. The idea of Göring, the corrupt, lazy, incompetent Göring, trying to usurp his power, is a profound personal insult. This isn't just politics. It's a stab in the back from the man who had been with him from the early days of the Nazi Party. His rage is volcanic. He screams about betrayal, ingratitude, and corruption. He immediately strips Göring of all his titles and offices and orders his arrest. SS troops are dispatched to Berchtesgaden, and Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, is placed under house arrest, his political career ending not with a bang, but with a telegram. For Hitler, this betrayal is a deep wound. But it is nothing compared to what comes next, because the next betrayal comes from the one man he believed was the epitome of loyalty. The man known as the true Heinrich, the faithful Heinrich, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer, Sue, the architect of the Holocaust, the head of the Gestapo. More than anyone, Himmler was the true believer, the high priest of the Nazi cult. His entire identity was built on the principles of loyalty, obedience, and racial purity. He saw his SS as a new Teutonic knighthood, bound by an unbreakable oath to their Führer. If anyone was expected to go down with the ship, it was Himmler. But Himmler is also a pragmatist. He can see the war is lost. For months, he has been having his own doubts. Unlike the fanatics in the bunker, he understands the military reality. He thinks there's a chance, a slim one, to save something from the wreckage. He dreams of leading a post-Hitler Germany, of negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies, Britain and the United States. His bizarre logic is that they would need him and his SS to fight against the real enemy, the Soviet Union. It's a complete fantasy, a grotesque misreading of the entire political situation. The Allies have been clear. They will only accept unconditional surrender from Germany. They see no difference between Hitler and Himmler. To them, Himmler is the personification of Nazi evil. But Himmler, blinded by his own sense of importance, doesn't see this. Through a contact in Sweden, Count Folke Bernadotte of the Red Cross, Himmler makes his secret offer. He proposes that Germany surrender on the Western Front while continuing to fight the Soviets in the East. He presents himself as the new, reasonable leader of Germany, claiming Hitler is finished, likely already dead or about to be. The news of Himmler's secret negotiations doesn't reach the bunker through official channels. It comes, of all things, from a foreign radio broadcast. On the night of April 28th, one of the bunker's staff is monitoring the BBC. He picks up a Reuters news report detailing Himmler's surrender offer to the Western Allies. The news spreads through the bunker like a virus. When Hitler is told, his reaction is beyond rage. It is a complete and total psychological collapse. Göring was a corrupt opportunist. His betrayal was, in a way, understandable. But Himmler, the faithful Heinrich? This is a betrayal of the soul. The man who swore eternal loyalty, whose entire organization was built on an oath to him personally, has been secretly negotiating behind his back. It's the ultimate act of treachery. Witnesses describe a scene of almost theatrical madness. Hitler's face turns purple. He convulses with fury, shrieking at a level of intensity no one had ever seen before. He screams that this is the most shameful betrayal in human history. Every principle he believed in, every oath he had taken as sacred, has been defiled. He feels utterly and completely alone. The last pillar of his world has crumbled. This is the moment that truly breaks him. Not the Red Army at the gates, not the bombed-out cities, not the military defeat. It is the personal betrayal. The realization that his most devoted disciple, the man he trusted implicitly, has abandoned him. In his warped mind, he had built a movement on loyalty, and now he sees that it was all a lie. Everyone has forsaken him. His immediate reaction is vengeful. He can't reach Himmler, who is in northern Germany. But there's a Himmler representative in the bunker, Hermann Fegelein. Fegelein is an SS general, but more importantly, he is married to Eva Braun's sister Gretel. This makes him part of the family. A few days earlier, Fegelein had slipped out of the bunker, trying to escape Berlin in civilian clothes. He was found in his apartment, drunk, with a suitcase full of cash, ready to flee. Hitler had him brought back and demoted, but Eva Braun had pleaded for her brother-in-law's life. Now all mercy is gone. In the wake of Himmler's betrayal, Hitler sees Fegelein as his master's proxy. He orders him to be court-martialed and executed. Fegelein is dragged out into the Reich Chancellery garden and shot. It's a final, futile act of revenge. The betrayal by Himmler galvanizes Hitler's final decision. There is nothing left to live for. His ideology is in ruins, his Reich is gone, and his inner circle has proven to be a nest of vipers. He dictates his last will and political testament. In it, he officially expels both Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party, denouncing them as traitors. He appoints Admiral Karl Dönitz, the head of the Navy, as his successor, a man he barely knew, but who was, crucially, far from the cesspool of intrigue in Berlin. Then he prepares for his own end. He marries Eva Braun, his longtime mistress, in a bizarre, pathetic ceremony in the bunker's map room. It as his final gesture of loyalty to the one person who had remained with him to the end. On April 30th, 1945, less than 48 hours after learning of Himmler's betrayal, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun say their goodbyes to the remaining staff. They retreat to their private quarters. A single gunshot is heard. The circle of betrayal is complete. The Führer is dead, not just defeated by his enemies, but broken by his friends. In the end, the man who demanded absolute loyalty from a nation died utterly alone, convinced that everyone he had ever trusted had turned against him. It was a fittingly dark and paranoid end to a reign built on fear and falsehood. The end was here. Deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, in the suffocating concrete tomb of the Führerbunker, the final, bizarre act of the Third Reich was about to unfold. The Red Army was closing in, their artillery turning the city above into a smoldering ruin. For Adolf Hitler and the sycophants who remained, all hope was gone. What followed was not a heroic last stand, but a grim, surreal cabaret played out in the face of annihilation. On the night of April 28th, as the bunker trembled with the constant explosions, Hitler decided it was time to put his affairs in order. He summoned his secretary, Trottel Jung, to a small conference room. The atmosphere was thick with despair and the smell of stale air and concrete dust. Here, with the world crashing down around him, Hitler began to dictate his final two documents. The first was his political testament. This wasn't a document of remorse or reflection. It was a final, venomous diatribe, a torrent of self-pity and hate that echoed the very ideas that had plunged the world into war. He showed no regret, no understanding of the catastrophe he had unleashed. Instead, he doubled down on his paranoid delusions, blaming international Jewry for starting the war and for his ultimate failure. It was the same old, poisonous rhetoric, now just a hollow echo in a failing dictator's bunker. In this testament, he also settled his final political scores. He lashed out at those he believed had betrayed him. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, were officially expelled from the Nazi Party and stripped of all their titles. Himmler had infuriated Hitler by trying to secretly negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies. Göring had sent a telegram suggesting he take over leadership as Hitler was trapped in Berlin. In Hitler's eyes, this was high treason. He ordered their arrests, a feudal command from a leader whose authority barely extended beyond the walls of his concrete coffin. He then appointed his chosen successors, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as the new president of the Reich, and Joseph Goebbels as the new chancellor. It was a reshuffling of deck chairs on a sinking battleship. After finishing this hateful screed, Hitler moved on to the second document, his private will. This was a much more personal, almost mundane text. He spoke of his private possessions, his art collection, and his decision to remain and die in Berlin. He declared that he and his longtime companion, Eva Braun, had chosen death over the disgrace of deposition or capitulation. He confirmed their marriage and stated they would be cremated immediately after their suicide. It was a strangely organized farewell from a man who had brought nothing but chaos to the world. And then came the most grotesque moment of all. Just after midnight on April 29th, with the Soviet shells screaming overhead, Hitler decided to marry Eva Braun. For over a decade, she had been his largely hidden mistress. Now, in their final hours, he would finally give her the title she had long desired. It was a wedding at the end of the world. A minor city official, Walter Wagner, a Goebbels loyalist who happened to be fighting with a Home Guard unit nearby, was located in the rubble and brought down into the bunker to perform the ceremony. Dressed in his Nazi party uniform, Wagner was probably stunned to find himself presiding over this macabre event. He had to ask Hitler and Braun to confirm they were of pure Aryan descent and free from hereditary diseases. In the midst of total destruction, the absurd racial purity laws of the regime were still being observed. The ceremony was brief. Eva wore a long black silk dress, Hitler his usual black trousers and gray military jacket. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, served as the witnesses. The vows were exchanged in the small map room, the epicenter of Hitler's failed military strategy. With a simple "I do," Eva Braun became Eva Hitler, a bride for little more than a day. Following the ceremony, the newlyweds and their inner circle, the Goebbels, Bormann, and his secretaries gathered for what they called a wedding breakfast. Champagne was brought out, but the mood was anything but celebratory. It was a ghastly parody of normal life. They sat together, making small talk, reminiscing about the better days of the Nazi Party's rise. Hitler spoke of his plans to die, his voice calm and detached. The others, trapped in this final insane drama, tried to maintain a facade of normality, all while knowing that their own deaths were just hours away. Imagine the scene, the clinking of champagne glasses, the forced conversation, all punctuated by the thunderous roar of artillery from above. The newly minted Frau Hitler spoke of her pride in becoming the wife of the Führer, even in death. The others listened, their faces pale in the harsh electric light of the bunker. They were ghosts at a banquet, living out the final pathetic moments of a monstrous regime they had helped create. This wasn't a tragedy in the classical sense. It was a pathetic, self-inflicted implosion. The grand, thousand-year Reich wasn't ending with a bang, but with a bizarre, champagne-fueled whimper in a concrete hole, a final, desperate attempt to pretend that any of it had ever meant anything. The next day, the charade would be over, and the world would be left to clean up the ruins. The morning of April 30th, 1945, the Führerbunker in Berlin isn't the command center anymore. It's a tomb. Above ground, the world is ending. The relentless roar of Soviet artillery shakes the very foundations of the Reich Chancellery. The Red Army is no longer on the outskirts of Berlin. They are fighting street by street, now just a few hundred meters away in the Tiergarten Park. Down below, in the stale, concrete-scented air, the mood is one of utter despair. The final act of a global tragedy is about to unfold. For Adolf Hitler, the war is lost. His 1,000-year Reich has crumbled to dust in a mere 12 years. But his greatest fear isn't death. He's always seen a glorious, self-inflicted end as his destiny. No, his ultimate terror is capture. The thought of being taken alive by the Soviets haunts his every waking moment. He has vivid, nightmarish visions of being drugged, put on display, and paraded through Red Square in a cage, a spectacle for the world to jeer at. This humiliation is a fate worse than any death he can imagine. To escape this nightmare, he has prepared two methods. He keeps a Walther PPK 7.65mm pistol, its cold steel a constant reminder of one possible exit. The other option is quicker, quieter, a small, unassuming cyanide capsule, potent enough to end everything in seconds. But in these final paranoid hours, his mind is a labyrinth of suspicion. Just days before, his most loyal henchman, Heinrich Himmler, had attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. This betrayal has shattered Hitler's trust in everyone and everything. If his most devoted follower could betray him, what about the poison? He begins to suspect the cyanide capsules supplied by Himmler's SS might be fake. A dud, a trick to ensure his capture. This paranoia gnaws at him. He cannot risk the capsule failing. He needs to be certain. He needs to test it. The decision is made, cold and absolute. His personal physician, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfiger, is summoned. The order is given. The subject for this grim experiment is to be Blondie, his beloved German shepherd. Blondie had been his constant companion, a gift from Martin Bormann, and one of the few living beings for whom Hitler seemed to show genuine affection. He was often photographed with her, presenting an image of a gentle dog lover to the German people. She had just given birth to a litter of puppies in the bunker, a fleeting moment of new life amidst the overwhelming presence of death. But now, affection and loyalty mean nothing. Certainty is everything. Blondie is brought to him. Dr. Stumpfiger takes a pair of pliers, forces the dog's mouth open, and crushes the small glass capsule. The effect is instantaneous. Blondie convulses and collapses, dead on the floor. Hitler observes the process without a flicker of emotion, his face a stone mask. The test is a success. The poison is genuine. His path to escape is now clear. For the other inhabitants of the bunker, this act was perhaps the most chilling of all. If he could so clinically dispatch his beloved dog, what hope was there for any of them? The final farewells began. The end was no longer a question of if, but of when. At around 3:15 in the afternoon, after a quiet final meal, the end begins. The scene is not some grand Wagnerian opera, but a sterile, underground bunker, 50 feet beneath the bombed-out ruins of Berlin. This is the Vorbunker, the final pathetic stage for one of history's most monstrous figures. Adolf Hitler and his new wife, Eva Braun, emerge from their private quarters for the last time. They had married just hours before, a bizarre ceremony in the dead of night as the Soviet army closed in, a grim wedding in a concrete tomb. Now, waiting for them in the narrow hallway is a small, somber group. These are the last of the inner circle, the most loyal, the ones who had followed him to the very end. There's Joseph Goebbels, the fanatical propaganda minister, his face ashen. Martin Bormann, the shadowy party chief, ever the loyal secretary. And Hitler's personal secretaries, women who had been with him for years, now standing as silent witnesses to the final pathetic act of this tragedy. The air is thick, not with drama, but with a surreal, exhausted, and suffocating sense of ritual. It's the end of a world they had helped create, and it's collapsing in on itself right here in this cramped corridor. Hitler, a stooped, trembling figure, a shadow of the man who had once mesmerized millions, walks slowly down the line. His face is a gray, emotionless mask. He offers a weak handshake to each person. No grand speeches, no final pronouncements of a 1,000-year Reich. Just a tired, mechanical gesture. His hand is limp, his eyes vacant. The man who had commanded armies and decided the fate of nations is now just an old, defeated man going through the motions of a final, bleak farewell. Eva Braun follows him. She tries to offer a few words, a tearful smile, but her voice breaks. She, who had dreamed of being the First Lady of Germany, is now just the bride of a dead man walking. She gives a few small gifts, a silver fox fur coat to one secretary, a last memento of a life of stolen luxury that is about to be extinguished. The atmosphere is heavy with unspoken words, with the stench of failure and impending death. This isn't the glorious downfall of a hero. It's the quiet, administrative process of self-destruction. Then the moment is over. The handshakes are done. The quiet goodbyes are said. Hitler and Eva Braun turn and walk back into their small private study. It's a simple room, furnished with a sofa, a small table, and the portrait of Frederick the Great that Hitler so admired. They close the heavy steel door behind them. The click of the lock is a sound of finality. The door is sealed from the inside. Outside in the hallway, the remaining few just stand there, waiting. What do you do in a moment like that? They wait. Time stretches. The only sound is the constant muffled thud of Soviet artillery shells hitting the Chancellery garden above. A constant rhythmic reminder of the world ending just a few feet over their heads. They listen, straining their ears, waiting for the sound that they know must come. 1 minute passes, then 2. The silence in the bunker, punctuated only by the distant explosions, is more deafening than any noise. For about 10 minutes, this strange vigil continues. An eternity in a concrete box. The staff, including a young telephone operator who had just been ushered into the hallway, simply wait in a state of suspended animation. The world outside is burning, and they are frozen in time, waiting for the definitive sound, and then it comes. Sharp, clear, and unmistakable, even through the thick steel door. A single gunshot. It cuts through the muffled sounds of war, a definitive, shocking crack. The spell is broken. After a few moments of stunned silence, Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, and Martin Bormann slowly push the door open. A thin wisp of smoke, smelling of burnt cordite, drifts out into the hallway. Inside the study, the scene is grim and final. Hitler is slumped on the sofa. A Walther pistol has fallen from his hand onto the floor. A dark stain is spreading from a self-inflicted wound to his right temple. The man who had plunged the world into war, who was responsible for the deaths of millions, had ended his own life in this small, airless room. Beside him, Eva Braun is also lifeless. She had chosen poison, biting down on a cyanide capsule. She lies on the sofa, her face contorted, a small vial of poison on the floor beside her. The dictator and his one-day bride dead together. The immediate aftermath is a flurry of panicked, almost rehearsed activity. The bodies are quickly wrapped in gray army blankets. They can't be left here. SS guards carry the 2 bundles up the narrow concrete stairs, out of the bunker, and into the desolate, shell-pocked garden of the Reich Chancellery. The sky is a dirty gray, filled with smoke and the red glow of fires. Berlin is a city in its death throes. The bodies are placed in a shallow crater, a scar left by a Soviet shell. The soldiers pour an after can of gasoline over them. It's a desperate, frantic attempt to erase the evidence. to prevent the bodies from being captured and displayed as trophies by the advancing Red Army. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann stand watching. Someone throws a lit rag onto the gasoline-soaked blankets. With a whoosh, the bodies are engulfed in flames. A thick, black, oily smoke billows up into the gray Berlin sky. The men give a final, stiff-armed Nazi salute to the burning pyre, a last gesture of defiance to their fallen leader. Then, they quickly retreat back into the relative safety of the bunker, leaving the bodies to burn. The flames, however, are not strong enough. The fire smolders and sputters in the open air, a pathetic, incomplete cremation. The final act of the Third Reich wasn't a blaze of glory, but a failed, sordid backyard burning. The next day, Soviet soldiers would find the charred, unrecognizable remains in that same shell crater. Dental records would confirm the identities. The grand 1,000-year empire had lasted just 12 years, and it ended not with a bang, but with a gunshot in a bunker and a smelly, undignified fire in a ruined garden. The act was complete. The monster was dead, but the world he had poisoned would take generations to heal. April 30th, 1945. Deep beneath the rubble of Berlin, in the Führerbunker, an eerie silence had fallen. For a few long minutes, no one moved. Then, Adolf Hitler's personal aide, Otto Gunsche, and his valet, Heinz Linge, cautiously pushed open the door to Hitler's private study. The air inside was thick and acrid, a strange mix of burnt almonds, the telltale sign of cyanide, and the sharp scent of gunpowder. The scene that greeted them was the final, pathetic act of the Third Reich. There, slumped on a floral-patterned sofa, was the Führer. He had taken his own life, a single gunshot wound to the right temple. The pistol, a Walther PPK, lay on the floor by his feet. Beside him was Eva Braun, his wife of less than 40 hours. She had chosen a different path, opting solely for a cyanide capsule. In death, her face was strangely serene, untouched by the violence that had consumed her husband. Her features were contorted, but there was no visible wound. For the men standing in the doorway, shock quickly gave way to a grim sense of duty. They had one last fanatical order to carry out, an order that came directly from Hitler himself. His body and Eva's must never fall into the hands of the advancing Soviet army. He was terrified of being captured and put on display in a Moscow cage, a fate he considered worse than death. The humiliation of his Italian counterpart, Mussolini, whose body had been publicly desecrated, haunted his final days. His remains had to be utterly destroyed, erased from history. The grim task began. Members of Hitler's bodyguard detail were summoned. They gently wrapped the two corpses in gray field blankets, completely concealing them. The small group then began the arduous journey up from the bunker's depths. They carried their macabre burdens up the concrete stairs of the emergency exit, a narrow passage leading to the world above. 40 steps. 40 steps from the suffocating tomb of the bunker into the apocalyptic chaos of the Reich Chancellery Garden. As they emerged into the open air, the scene was one of utter devastation. The once manicured gardens were now a desolate, cratered moonscape, churned up by relentless artillery fire. The sky was a hazy, smoke-filled brown, and the thunder of Soviet shells exploding nearby was constant, a deafening soundtrack to the end of the world. Shrapnel whizzed through the air, forcing the men to duck and keep moving. There was no time for ceremony, no room for reverence. This was a desperate, frantic race against time and the Red Army, now just a few hundred meters away. They located a shallow crater, a fresh wound in the earth left by a recent explosion. It would have to do. They carefully laid the two blanket-wrapped bodies side by side in the depression. But this was only the beginning. The order was for complete annihilation, and that required fuel, a lot of it. The men scrambled back towards the bunker's entrance, their mission now a desperate search for gasoline. Inside the bunker's garage, they found what they needed, jerry cans filled with petrol. They formed a human chain, passing the heavy cans, known as canisters, up the stairs and out into the garden. One by one, they emptied them over the bodies. 10 cans, 20 cans. They kept going, soaking the blankets, the ground, everything. In total, they poured nearly 200 liters of gasoline onto the makeshift pyre. The fumes were overpowering, mixing with the dust and smoke of the battlefield. Now came the final moment. Erich Kempka, Hitler's personal chauffeur, was given the task of igniting the pyre. He took a rag, soaked it in gasoline, and lit it with a match. Without hesitation, he tossed the flaming cloth into the shell hole. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A massive fireball erupted with a deafening whoosh, sending a pillar of black, oily smoke spiraling into the gray Berlin sky. The fire roared, a grotesque, chemical-fueled inferno. Those who remained, including Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, and the men who had carried the bodies, stood back at the entrance of the bunker. They watched the blaze for a moment, raised their arms in a final stiff-armed salute, and then quickly retreated back into the concrete shelter, driven back by the intense heat and the continuous shelling. The funeral of Adolf Hitler was not a solemn affair attended by a grieving nation. It was a hurried, panicked, and gruesome disposal, witnessed by a handful of his most loyal sycophants under the constant threat of enemy fire. For the next 2 hours, the fire raged. The gasoline burned with such intensity that it consumed almost everything. But the cremation was incomplete. When the flames finally died down, what remained were charred, unrecognizable fragments. Later that evening, SS guards returned to the site. They gathered the ashes and bone fragments, buried them in another nearby crater, and did their best to conceal the location. Their efforts, however, were ultimately in vain. The very next day, Soviet soldiers of the Smersh counterintelligence unit stormed the chancellery. They had been given specific orders to find Hitler, dead or alive. Following witness testimony and the telltale signs of the fire, they soon discovered the burial site. They exhumed the charred remains, along with the bodies of the Goebbels family and Hitler's dogs. Dental records, confirmed by Hitler's captured dental assistant, provided the final undeniable proof. The man who had plunged the world into war and orchestrated unspeakable horrors was, indeed, dead. The Soviets, wanting to control the narrative and prevent any chance of a gravesite becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis, kept their discovery a closely guarded secret for decades. The remains were secretly buried, exhumed, and reburied several times at different locations in East Germany. Finally, in 1970, on the orders of the KGB, the last fragments were exhumed one final time, completely incinerated, and the ashes were unceremoniously scattered into a tributary of the Elbe River. And so, the gasoline cremation in the Chancellery Garden was not the final chapter. It was merely the beginning of a bizarre, 25-year-long epilogue, as the Soviets went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that not a single physical trace of Adolf Hitler remained on this earth. The man who wanted to build a 1,000-year empire was reduced to a handful of ash, scattered on the wind, a final, fittingly empty end to a legacy of absolute destruction. April 1945. Berlin is a hellscape of fire, smoke, and steel. The symphony of destruction, a thunderous roar of Soviet artillery, is the final soundtrack for the Third Reich. Deep beneath the rubble, in a concrete bunker, the man who unleashed this apocalypse is cornered. The world he sought to conquer is now collapsing in on him, literally. This isn't the story of a soldier's last stand. It's the story of a coward's final act. Adolf Hitler, the Führer, the man who promised Germany a 1,000-year empire, was now a prisoner of his own making. His grand visions of Germania, a new world capital, were buried under 1,000,000 tons of debris. The armies he once commanded, which had stormed across Europe, were now shattered remnants, ghosts fighting in the ruins of their own capital. Up on the surface, the fighting was desperate and brutal. The last defenders of Berlin were a tragic mix of old men from the Volkssturm, hardened veterans, and even children from the Hitler Youth, barely old enough to hold a rifle. They were fighting and dying for a cause that was already lost, for a leader who had already abandoned them. Hitler occasionally emerged from his subterranean tomb to offer hollow encouragement, pinning medals on a few of these child soldiers. It was a grotesque piece of theater, a final cynical manipulation. He was sending them to their deaths while meticulously planning his own escape from justice. Inside the Führerbunker, the atmosphere was a bizarre cocktail of denial, panic, and morbid festivity. While Berlin burned, Hitler married Eva Braun. There was a small, grim celebration with champagne. It was a wedding in a tomb, a final, perverse act of normalcy as their world disintegrated. Hitler was no longer the magnetic orator who had mesmerized a nation. He was a trembling, broken man, his health failing, his orders increasingly detached from the reality unfolding just a few feet above his head. He railed against his generals, his people, anyone he could blame for his own monumental failure. In his last political testament, Hitler revealed the core of his ideology, pure, unadulterated nihilism. He didn't lament the destruction of Germany. Instead, he blamed the German people for not being worthy of his genius. He believed they had failed him. He ordered a scorched earth policy, the Nero Decree, commanding that all of Germany's infrastructure be destroyed. If he couldn't rule the world, he would drag his own nation down with him into the abyss. Thankfully, his minister Albert Speer largely ignored these final, insane orders. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet soldiers just a few hundred yards away, the final act took place. After saying his goodbyes, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to their private quarters. The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. It was over. The man who had plunged the world into its most destructive war, responsible for the deaths of tens of millions, did not face his enemies. He did not lead his final troops into battle. He didn't stand trial for his crimes. He fled the world he had set on fire with a self-inflicted wound in a concrete hole. His body was hastily carried upstairs, doused in petrol, and set alight in a shallow crater in the Chancellery garden. It was a sordid, pathetic end, a stark contrast to the grand Wagnerian funeral he might have imagined for himself. The so-called 1,000-year Reich, which had lasted a mere 12 years, was extinguished not with a thunderous bang, but with a sordid, pathetic whisper. The gunshot in the bunker was the death knell of the Nazi regime. Within days, Berlin fell, and on May 8th, Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But the legacy of that gunshot, the end of that dark chapter, reminds us of a crucial lesson. that ideologies built on hatred and nihilism ultimately consume themselves, and that the grandest ambitions of tyranny can end in the most squalid and cowardly of ways. Thanks for watching, and if you found this piece of history interesting, consider subscribing for more.